If you live in Nevada this week and needed to use the DMV, then you don't need me to tell you that. No, you didn't. Why, yes, that's because the DMV was one of over a dozen agencies brought to their knees by a cyber attack. Maybe the worst cyber attack this state's ever seen. Maybe ever. But as state workers finally dig out of this hole, we're left with one question. What the hell is even going on here? From Battle Born Progress, this is Battle Born Bytes. My name is Jacob. Let's update our passwords. So let's start with the facts on this one. Sometime early on Sunday, August 24th, state IT employees start noticing some unusual activity inside state databases. And by late Sunday, everyone's fears are confirmed. Buddy, Nevada's getting cyber-attacked. Publicly, this was very noticeable starting the next day when state offices were all closed. At around 8 a.m., the state attorney general's office tweeted that, yep, there was a significant network degradation and that the governor's office had ordered all state offices closed. But it wouldn't be until around noon that the governor's office said anything of actual substance. In a memo, the governor's office identified a network security incident, which is one way to put it, yeah. I was going to do a bit like at Grok, what is a network security incident? But, you can't count out the average Twitter user. You just simply can't count them out. More importantly, at that juncture, the governor's office says that there was as yet no evidence that information had been compromised. But go ahead and put a pin in that one. We'll get to it later. Based on that statement, on that Monday, it was not immediately clear how bad the hack was or what was even hacked in the first place. Then state offices are closed on Tuesday. And again on Wednesday. By this point, the governor's office, sensing people desire information, release this video, which needs to be seen to be believed.
On Sunday morning, a network security incident was identified on state systems. Recovery efforts began immediately and are continuing around the clock. At this time, there is no evidence that personal information has been compromised. The issue only affects state government systems.
The Getty Images School of Crisis Management. Realizing stock footage is probably not enough, the governor's office does eventually call a press conference for last Wednesday, which is notably not including the governor, who was, let me check my notes, he was busy opening a Mormon temple in Elko. As you do. What we do get at this press conference is more information on what systems are actually being affected. Of course, the DMV was one of the majorly affected state agencies, but also the State Department of Human Services and the Department of Business and Industry. On Wednesday, local media also reported that the State Attorney General's office had instructed employees to stop using state-issued computers and no longer connect to the Wi-Fi at its Las Vegas office. Spooky. What we did not get from this press conference, however, was more details on who did it, why they did it, or what they accessed. Take a listen.
I must disclose that our ongoing forensic investigation has found evidence that indicates some data has been exfiltrated or moved outside the state network by the malicious actors.
I'll be honest, watching that doesn't make me feel great. It also did finally confirm that this was a ransomware attack. More on that later. But any question about who did this or why, that went unanswered. That's mostly because the state started citing a national security law, which means they don't have to give out information to the public if it relates to national security. So, guess we're not going to know anything, probably. That being said, there is this interview from last week from the Nevada Independent, who found an anonymous state IT professional. They, and we'll put the quote on screen here, basically said, yeah, this was probably a two-pronged ransomware attack. One prong aimed at accessing sensitive data, the other aimed at building an encryption wall around that data so the state would have to pay the hackers to get it back. That is why they call it ransomware after all, because they hold it hostage. So a day after that, and now under pressure to put himself in front of a camera, Governor Joe Lombardo does call another press conference in Las Vegas.
I understand my presence was noticed in yesterday's press conference, and I appreciate the notice.
However, once again, we don't really get any new details on what the hack was targeting or why or who. Really more of it's a part two of, hey, here are the systems we know are really thrashed right now, and here's what's working. Now, these kinds of ransomware attacks are obviously not a new thing. Hackers the world over have actually been increasing the intensity and frequency of ransomware attacks in the last decade. And that's especially true of ransomware attacks on both corporations and local governments. Anyone in Las Vegas probably remembers the 2023 hack of both Caesars Entertainment and MGM Resorts. Those two ransomware attacks are actually interesting case studies of what happens after the fact. So, in the case of Caesars Entertainment, Caesars actually paid $15 million to the hackers, about half of what the hackers were asking for to unlock their systems. They then waited a couple weeks to tell anyone about it, which is not what they're supposed to do. You're supposed to wait like a couple of days, but it is neither here nor there. In the end, Caesars said they lost a negligible amount of money on their bottom line and that it was mostly covered by insurance. MGM was the interesting case. They tried to fight the hackers off and didn't pay the ransom, but what they also did was not tell anyone that the hack was happening. 8 days after the hack started, they issued a statement that everything was fine, despite social media reports that everything was not, in fact, fine. Right away, MGM said they lost about $100 million from the hack, though that doesn't include the fallout from a dozen class action lawsuits that followed. More than that, MGM did admit that at least some customer data was accessed, including social security numbers and passport numbers for some customers, though there was no financial information compromised. So there's that. At the end of the day, MGM was also fundamentally a little blasé after the fact and said it was all covered by insurance, so we're good. Less good, these kinds of ransomware attacks are now essentially the new normal. For example, in 2020, literally 5 years ago, there were more than 2,400 attacks on local governments holding key systems hostage for large ransoms. But this attack on Nevada seems to be the first of its kind on an actual state, and unfortunately, it may not be the last. Okay, by the time you're watching this, Nevada may or may not have finally put all of its systems back online. And hopefully you, living in the future, know more than me, living in the past, trying to record this video right now. There was, in fact, another press conference on Thursday that didn't reveal much new of anything.
How do you think this attack will impact your chances for re-election?
Good question.
In the short term, though, this hack has been a disaster. Take the DMV, for instance. There are now massive delays on everything from getting IDs to car registration renewals to new car sales and getting salvage VINs sorted. For the state police, they spent days without access to national background databases. And even now, public access for those systems, including fingerprinting and background checks, remains unavailable. And in the early days of the hacks, there were at least some media reports of vendors relying on stuff like Medicaid payments not actually getting those payments, though the state has said in the days since that those payments should be rolling. On that note, and in relative good news, the state's payroll has still been rolling and education funding was still able to go out. On top of that, there are some state agencies that ran their systems on completely different infrastructure than what was hacked. So stuff like the state's employment system, DETR, or its election systems and voter rolls under the Secretary of State remain unaffected. But while we wait for the fallout of this hack to finally materialize, what's left are questions about how prepared the state was and is for future attacks, and frankly, whether the federal government is ready to aid states when these attacks happen. Case in point is an agency called CISA, or the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. This agency was established actually under the first Trump administration in 2018, originally to help with federal cybersecurity and infrastructure security, as the name suggests. Since then, though, the agency has expanded its mandate to help private corporations and state and local governments when it comes to cybersecurity and, yes, ransomware attacks. Here's the thing about CISA, though. After the 2020 election, it became increasingly politicized. Its director refused to go along with baseless claims from then-President Donald Trump, and I guess now President Donald Trump, that the 2020 election had been stolen, based in large part on government supercomputers, his words, switching votes at the state level, which is not a thing that exists, because states run elections, not the federal government, but that's neither here nor there. Well, that guy got canned, and now he's the subject of an investigation by the DOJ. Why? Is it retributive? Who can say? Now, under purges from DOJ and congressional budget cuts, CISA has shed almost a third of its workforce, or over 1,000 employees. On top of that, basically all of CISA's top leadership are gone. Now, that's a fun state of affairs for an agency that is tasked with helping Nevada figure this out. So now we wait. The nature of any hack means that information comes out slowly, if at all, especially in cases of national security, where the government loves to be like, nope, we're not telling you anything, national security. For now, though, for the love of God, do not click on that suspicious link. But that does it for this week's episode of Battle Born Bytes. If you like the show, be sure to like and subscribe so you're the first to know when we upload a new episode. But until then, from Battle Born Progress, this has been Battle Born Bytes. My name is Jacob. We'll see you next week.